Well, thanks for having me. Like Christine said, my name is Taylor. In terms of intro, so I live in Cambridge with my husband Sean and our dog Kovu. Kovu is a very sweet golden retriever and knows no enemies, so he's my example of what it looks like to love all and assume all love you. And Sean and I both work with college students across Boston and Massachusetts. So another fun fact about me, I really love fantasy novels, and I read like a lot. I'll read anything from like high fantasy to like 1,000-page epics to kind of trash romance fantasy novels. I know that Christine's been reading the Throne of Glass series.
Let's go!
Yeah. And I just really love the fun of these stories. And just so you know that I'm serious, I actually wrote one of my college essays about this book called The Cry of the Ice Mark, which is like a children's book about a 13-year-old princess, and she forms an alliance with a kingdom of vampires and a kingdom of snow leopards to save her own kingdom from empire. And that was my reasoning for declaring an international relations major in college. So a lot of these stories, from like Tolkien to The Cry of the Ice Mark to Disney movies and fairy tales, they all kind of give us like a similar plot line. So we always open with a kingdom, and the kingdom is in distress. And it's usually under an evil or an unjust ruler, and conditions have deteriorated to the point of despair. But we know that out there somewhere, in some sort of unexpected place, is the rightful ruler. And they might be an orphan, or they might be like hidden away in a different land. They might be running around with a warthog and a meerkat in the wilderness if the rightful ruler is Simba. And the action builds, and the true identity of the rightful king or queen is revealed. And then they begin to put together a band of unlikely heroes, of hobbits or snow leopards or people who have been overlooked. And we start to prepare for the climactic action. And at this point in these stories, there's usually some sort of epic speech. Not always, but usually there's a speech that rallies the commoners in the crowd and secures their loyalty to the rightful king or queen. And then the whole mass of people cheer, and they go into battle for the kingdom with the rightful ruler in charge, and then there's victory. And the evil leader is vanquished, and the enemies are overcome, and peace and goodness are restored to the land. And we love these stories. Whether it comes in the form of one of these fantasy novels or a Disney movie or the Kendrick Lamar halftime show, we really love it when our enemies are put in their place and then our heroes get to take their victory lap. So we are in the book of Matthew, and Matthew opens with a kingdom in distress. Israel is under Roman occupation with a false king on the throne through the client King Herod. And the Israelites have been under occupation for hundreds of years, and they've been longing for a ruler that will put things right. And from the first words of Matthew, we have a genealogy, and this genealogy tells us that there is a different and rightful king, the Messiah from the line of King David. And he will come from an unexpected place, and he'll be hidden away in a different land so that he's not killed by Herod. And this king will grow up, and he begins to assemble his own band of unlikely heroes, of fishermen and zealots, and they're traveling around in the wilderness, and he's showing his power, and he's healing people, and he's proclaiming that the good news has come. And then we have crowds begin to assemble, and there's whispers of, is this the Messiah? And the crowds are following Jesus out of the city in masses. And then we get to our epic speech. And honestly, it starts off pretty great. The speech starts with, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And it feels a little challenging, but it's also empowering. It promises that there's a good thing out there for those who have been overlooked. But then Jesus keeps going, and then I think it feels like things start to take a little bit of a turn. And right at the moment where it seems like we should be getting these inspiring words that stir up the crowds and move us into the next phase of action, overcoming our enemies, instead we get, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now, we know that Jesus is like not just king, he's also a rabbi, a teacher, and he's like a distinctly Jewish Messiah. So I think some of the teachings on like law and morality that we get in the Sermon on the Mount, they're to be expected in a way that maybe we don't from like our fantasy king. And we also know that we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. We've been talking about this for a year now, and we know that Jesus is ushering in a completely different type of kingdom. So I recognize this like pivot probably wasn't surprising to any of us. But at the same time, does it feel like a little bit of a letdown? Is this really the kind of charge we want from the one who is supposed to look around at all the different injustice in the world and take charge and make things right? Did it feel like a good news for those who are suffering under occupation and injustice then? And does it feel like that for us today? So I've been asking around over the past few weeks to Christians and people who are not Christian about just like how they feel about loving their enemies right now. And the responses have been pretty much just not excited. People have said things to me like, I get the idea, but all I feel is rage. Or from people who are not Christian and not really even interested in the teachings of Jesus, I've heard the idea that like even the idea of loving your enemies is in itself unjust. How are we supposed to talk about love at all when our enemies are hurting other people and destroying things that we hold dear and are just generally wrong? And from Christians, I've really only mostly heard about obligation. Like, I know Jesus says to, but I don't really want to, or I feel like I have to, but this is too exhausting. And I think those responses are fair, which is part of like my nervousness in even talking about this today. Because we're in a current cultural and political moment where it feels like we're expected to have enemies. And you need to choose a side on every issue. And not choosing a side on every issue will also make you an enemy. And we have these like general vague ideas about civility or discourse that have been largely stripped away. And at the highest levels of our political system, all talk is about winning, about overturning, about utterly defeating our enemies. And it feels like if we want to be justice-oriented people, we have to engage on that level. But I want to suggest to us that for the people hearing Jesus say this, this was just as scandalous. Jesus is telling people that are hearing this sermon to love their enemies, and he's also doing things that are kind of offensive. He's hanging out with tax collectors, and they claim to be Jewish, but they've betrayed their own people, and they've gained power in a political system for themselves. Today, these might be people who say they're Christian, but then go and work for a political party we disagree with. And he's recruiting zealots, a religious sect that refused to pay taxes, believed in violent resistance, and set out to overthrow the Roman Empire. Today, we might call them militants or terrorists. And he does this in a context where his own people are under occupation. They're economically disenfranchised. So I think our current cultural and political climate aren't outside of the bounds of what Jesus could have thought about when he said these words. So we have to assume that by Jesus' actions, he knows the types of situations we might end up in, and he actually means what he says. So we're going to unpack a little bit about what he might mean. So first, who are our enemies? In the context of the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think Jesus is only talking about these like big picture political enemies that I'm kind of outlining. Earlier in the sermon, he speaks about leaving the altar to reconcile with someone else who has wronged you personally. But I also think he's not talking about these enemies who might be our enemies because of political, ethnic, and racial or religious differences. In this text, Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? And that phrase, your own people, I think the NLT that was read earlier had your friends, but it has a connotation of like people who share your same social standing or religious beliefs. And Jesus is saying that to be like God, we have to cross those lines. So I think that brings us to what does it mean to love? And Dan touched on this a little bit last month, but I think we can mix up love and approval. And my students talk like this a lot. They'll say things like, I couldn't ever try to love that person because other people might think I agree with them. But they also ask for love that way, and they say, if you really love me, then you'll support me no matter what I do and whatever decisions I make. But I don't think that's the type of love that Jesus is talking about. Last month, Dan spoke about how when Jesus is giving these instructions about turning the other cheek or giving a cloak, he's inviting his listeners into like a nonviolent resistance that breaks cycles of retribution. So we have Jesus setting up a moral standard and calling for justice. So I don't think love here just has to mean a lack of accountability. So these next couple sentences, I think, give us a little bit of a clue of what Jesus is thinking about when he talks about the love of God. So Jesus says, referring to God, he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So Jesus points to the provision of God and the type of world that God has set up. We might not use weather metaphors a lot when we talk about God, but in an agricultural society where rain and sun are needed for sustenance and for income, Jesus names God as the one who provides and the one who creates the kinds of conditions in which all can flourish. He tells those who are listening to pray for those who persecute them, suggesting that they're supposed to intercede on their enemies' behalf. And I think this action of praying for our enemies makes us like God because the character of God is to desire that all might live in a world where even our enemies actually have what they need to thrive. So I don't think love needs to mean like an approval or a lack of accountability, but it does seem to mean that we have to move out of frameworks of winners and losers and create the kinds of conditions that could be for our enemies' good. So I recognize, of course, like we might all have different barriers or things that are at stake for us when it comes to loving our enemies. And I also want to acknowledge that there's power imbalances in this for us. There's different levels of risk and safety when we think about what it might mean for us to love our enemies. And I think Jesus does invite discernment around that, particularly when there's like a personal or painful history or when safety is on the line. So I don't know how to, like, where to put those lines around what love might look like or who exactly God might call us to love. But I do feel pretty confident that Jesus probably puts them in a different place than where we would consider most comfortable. So we're going to move into discussion around this first part of the text in just a minute. I'm going to ask us to actually think a little bit around what are our own barriers to loving our enemies. And just to kind of kick us off, when I think about my own barriers to loving my enemies, for me, it's almost all bound up in my own desire to be right. There's very rarely any like safety concern on the line for me, but it's more that I just really like being seen right and proven right. And when I think about how like those I might think of as my enemies, if it's around like little interpersonal things, I find that one of the biggest things that limits my own ability to pray for them or to want their good is that I really want them to fail so that I seem successful. And when I think about these bigger, more consequential things where there's people who are actively harming me or others I care about, I still have to sort through my motivations a little bit around why I might not want to love them. And I think part of it is justice-oriented, and I want to stop the things they're doing that I think are wrong. But I think a lot of it is also me wanting to be seen publicly as like standing for the right things. And loving them or like working for conditions that would be for their good feel reputation compromising. But in preserving my own reputation and just wanting to win, I think I take options off the table around what love could look like that could actually be like good for them and also good for me. So I'm going to pause there before we talk about the last line in this set text and give us a little bit of space to discuss in like groups of 2, 3, 4. What are your barriers to loving your enemies? And then I'm curious also just like, why does this teaching feel so particularly challenging for us right now? There was a story of my own time when I was just becoming a Christian that was coming to mind around this. So I became a Christian in college, and the semester after I decided to follow Jesus, I was asked to help lead a small group for international students on campus. And my co-leader was an international student from Hong Kong. And one day we were like tabling on campus, inviting students to events, and these two girls walked up. and started talking to me, and I was like sharing with them about the group and things, and they were like really excited to be involved. And then they started talking to Edwin, my co-leader, and Edwin asked where they were from, and they were from mainland China. And when he said he was from Hong Kong, they just like looked at each other, cut off the conversation, and walked away. And like, I don't know how much you guys know about kind of relationships between Hong Kong and China, but this was at a time where there was kind of increased tension, and I didn't know what to do, so I kind of just stood there. But then Edwin like came out from behind the table, ran after them, like chased them down, and then invited them over to dinner at my place. He was like, they won't come if it's my place, but they'll come if it's yours. And like hosted them for a meal, even though they had like sent every indication that they wanted like nothing to do with him. And I think that was one of kind of my earliest experiences about thinking about like what does it mean to be Christian, but also like I don't know that Edwin had deep affection for them in that moment, but I think he did think like these two girls are like lonely, they're in America for the first time, they don't know anyone, like what could I do to create a condition in which like they could thrive, and like right now that might look like dinner. So that has really like shaped some of my own thinking about like what's possible here. So I want to move us to the last line in this part of the text, where Jesus says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And this sentence, I think it's not meant to be read as like just the end to this part, but really like the whole text that we've read in the Sermon on the Mount up to this point. And so Christine talked about this a year ago, but this word perfect is like kind of hard to translate. A better version of it might be something like maturity or completeness or like fully realized. And it's the same word used in a different text in 1 Corinthians 13, which I think I gave us. Yeah. So Paul is talking about love, and then he's talking about, in this text he's talking about kind of forward-looking, how will like love shape the church and then like new creation. So this part highlighted in blue, he says, "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears." And then he goes on to talk about his own kind of maturing in faith. But that word completeness is the same word as perfect on the text before. And I think it gives us this picture of like a wholeness and a maturity, and like a fully realized life with God. So when Jesus says it in the text we're looking at today, the "be perfect," it's not so much about like doing the right things, but it's actually about a call to like grow, mature into the kind of realized life that God has for us, and to be like God. So I think it's interesting that in this passage, when Jesus gives the example of the type of love that God shows, it's one that shows God's character as creator and provider. So Jesus references the sun and the rain, and that's God's creation. So I have a spiritual director, and she regularly says that God's nature is as creator, and he's always creating and inviting us into acts of creation. And when Jesus talks about these nonviolent acts in the part right before this with the cloak and the turning the other cheek, they are not just acts of love, they're also acts of creative resistance. And they open up a new pathway that's not just submission and not just violence, but actually a love that brings dignity to the one who extends it. And this word, this perfect, this completeness, fully realized, I think it's also meant to point us forward to the end of the story. So if we go back to our story of this rightful king, we know that after this speech, there won't be any kind of great rallying of the crowds or giant battle. But the words of Jesus, this king, about his enemies will be, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And Jesus is the rightful king, and he does win, even though winning ultimately looks entirely differently than what I was talking about in my fantasy novels. In his death and resurrection, Jesus performs a fundamentally creative act. In what looks like submission to his enemies, he actually defeats the real and true enemy, the one that all of our enemies are only shadows of, evil and sin and death. Even the disciples who betrayed him, he creates a new family out of those who could have been enemies. And all of our desires for justice and rightness and peace are found in him. So right now, we're still kind of in the middle of this mess of the world and what it looks like to love well. But I think it's helpful that we get to know the right and true and creative King. Where in every place where I long for justice, I get to know that the one who will ultimately vanquish every enemy is the judge. And in this new creation, the full, perfect wholeness that these scriptures are pointing to, I know that when I see Jesus face to face, he will probably tell me many, many things that I was wrong about, even in my deep desire to be right. But I get to know that while that could have made him my enemy, he acts with love. So as we wrap up, I want to invite us to see loving our enemies not just as an impractical or an obligational thing, but actually as a fundamentally creative act. As God creates his new creation in us and through us, and we grow into people who are shaped by this new creation, we get to see and do as God does. And I think we get to trust in God's creative power as we long for this kind of wholeness and invite God to shape our lives. So I have 2 final discussion questions for us. Another big one, it's okay if you don't arrive at an answer in the next 5 minutes, but how might you creatively love an enemy? Sean and I took a seminary class last year, and our professor would always talk about the difference God makes, what is the difference God makes? So I think whenever I think about things like this, I'm asking myself, what difference does it actually make to us that Jesus is our King? And what difference does it make to our enemies and the ways we treat them? So you can take either or both of those questions, and we'll talk for a few minutes.